Last week, I sat down with the founder and also the president of Exodus International, the ex-gay organisation that for decades had tormented gay Christians by lying that homosexuality can be cured. You can pray away the gay. So we thought we'd follow up and take a look at the history and the reality of gay conversion therapy more broadly. Joining us are Dr. David McDowell, Assistant Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Mount Sinai Medical Centre, Mathew Shurka, former reparative therapy patient, and Sean Sala, national LGBT policy activist and an ex-gay survivor himself. Joining me on set is Lila Shapiro, our very own HuffPost Gay Voices reporter. Lila, it's kind of amazing to some people that this is still going on. I think this is something that people associate with either the extremes of the Christian right in the 70s and 80s, but not that it's still happening now. What has your reporting uncovered?
Well, it's definitely still going on. And I think part of what we're seeing is the tail end of this PR blitz that happened in the late 90s, which kind of peaked in 1998 when a group of 16 or so Christian right organizations put forth a massive ad campaign in major newspapers like The Times, The Washington Post, USA Today, with a lot of them featured former, so-called self-proclaimed former lesbian Ann Paulk with the line, "I'm living proof, truth can set you free." And that created a lot of interest and got new psychiatrists interested and obviously new patients. And I think that, it's definitely fading out now, but there's still a lot of people that kind of got involved at that time and even, in the last decade. Obviously, Mathew Shurka is an example of someone who got involved in 2004.
Yeah, Mathew, I was amazed to hear the timeline of exactly when you were involved. I was amazed to see what a young guy you are, because to be honest, when I heard about your story, I was like, oh, this probably happened in the 80s.
Yeah, I was 16 years old. It was 2004. I'm 25 now, so it's pretty recent. And especially now going back and reuniting with my reparative therapist and reliving the experience and making peace with him, it feels fresh.
So just take us back to 2004. What happened?
So in 2004, I knew the feelings that I had for other men or the other boys growing up in my hometown. And it was a time that I chose to tell my father, who probably was also the most difficult to tell. And he was very compassionate at the time. He said he loved me no matter what. But it was in the weeks right after that he started to look for therapists that could really maybe offer something new, a possibility of changing, or maybe it's a phase I'm going through.
And just give people an impression of what the home environment was like. Were you a religious family? Where did you grow up?
Jewish conservative town called Great Neck. My family particularly is not very religious, but we do look at ourselves as conservative Jews. We did keep the holidays, and we are a very close-knit family. I definitely did not come from like a broken home of any sort. So it was more about, being with the family. No one in my family has ever dealt with homosexuality before. This is something that's very new, and yet I can say maybe naive for my family to know anything about. So going into the therapy, my mother was not for it, but didn't feel strong enough to say anything against it. And yet my father was the one who was more adamant about it and really wanted to take, in his eyes, it was saving my life and really not dealing with how life hard is and not making it harder as a homosexual for myself.
And what did the therapy entail?
So being not religious, I made sure that I didn't want any therapist to come to me and say, listen, you're going to pray the gay away. So it was all based on science, based on Freudian theory. And initially what we had to do was clear the void that a gay man has that he is missing from his relationship with his father. So the very first thing I had to do was avoid women at all costs, including female friends at school, and that included my mother and my sisters, which then my father and the therapist worked hard at creating. So for about 2 years living at home with my family, I did not talk to my mother and my sisters, and I gave it my best and kept that alive. So it was very awkward. My mom would make me breakfast, and that meant I would walk right out the door and go to school and come back and really make no communication with her.
How did she respond to that? I mean, when she makes you breakfast, she gives you a kiss on the cheek and you just wander off? She says, I love you, and you just ignore her?
So there was minimal conversation, and this has started to create the breakdown in my family. So there was turmoil between my parents and between us, because at that point, if my mom had asked me, how's the therapy going, I would say, I want this. And it was coming from fear. I thought the worst thing that I could ever do was to come out as a homosexual man. So I gave it my best, and I followed the therapy, and that included going against my mom's wishes, which was having communication with her.
And how long did the therapy last? What brought an end to it?
I was in it for about 5 years on and off. And the first stretch was about 3 years with one particular therapist. And it was at the decline of that therapy that I then became estranged from my father, estranged from my family, and moved away from home to really start my own life and try and figure it out on my own. And yeah.
And you said you've had a reconciliation with your therapist.
Yes, that was the journey I began in January. I had a YouTube video that was released in October of 2012, and I was then invited by the NCLR, which is the National Center of Lesbian Rights, to speak at the convention Creating Change in Atlanta. And it was at that time that I said, you know what, I really want to reach out to this therapist and let him know what I'm sharing on this public platform, which is really my experience with this man. And whether it was a hellish experience or a good experience, this person has had a big impact in my life. So it started with a phone call, and one thing led to another, and I got to really get his world, his life has been like. And to my surprise, I was one of the last therapy patients he's had. He claims that I was about 12 to 15 guys he's never cured, and that this has now been his own personal struggle in his own life, in his career, and what he has to do to keep his reputation not destroyed.
Yeah. Do you think that it's had any lasting impact?
On me?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm dating. I still have moments where I think maybe I still question myself at times, but going through this process of really reconciling with a therapist has been the most affirmative thing I've done. And also creating peace with my father. And really declaring this is who I am and this is who I'm going to be, and have their love and support. I think the last 6 months have really been the most affirming for me.
It's interesting. It's fascinating. What does your dad make of it now?
He's, like I said, not religious. He supports me. He loves me. He doesn't find anything wrong with me being gay. He just thinks, it's something you should be quiet about and keep it to yourself. He's in more of the survival mindset of, the world is the way the world is. Just take care of yourself and don't worry about anyone else. Yet I think my story speaks to a lot of people, and I've been getting that reaction for the responses I'm getting. There are a lot of people dealing with this issue of homosexuality, and also it's really a situation between parents and child, and how the parents react and how the parents take care of their child when this circumstance comes their way.
Dr. McDowell, when I hear stories like Sean's, which we'll get to in a moment, I spoke to Sean last week, which are from the evangelical Christian community, where there are religious churches that engage in this kind of stuff, I'm somewhat less surprised. When I hear secular versions of the story, like what Mathew just told us, it absolutely flabbergasts me that there are people who can call themselves therapists and engage in this sort of thing. Can you just explain to us the impact that it has?
It flabbergasts me too, although they still are out there. I think that most therapists want to help people, and when they hear of somebody who says they're suffering and wants to change, there might be an impulse to help that person do what they say, even if it's impossible. And that's what you had here with reparative therapy. Now, luckily enough, Mathew seems a very resilient and gifted young man and seems to have survived very well. But this therapy can be brutal and very traumatic. And the patients that I've seen who've been through this, most of them still suffer all of the assaults on self-esteem, the assaults on even identity, and have very post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms related to this. So it can be devastating, and that sort of effect can last for a very long time.
Is there a sub-community of psychiatrists or psychotherapists who still believe in this stuff and believe that they have scientific evidence for it, or do you regard it as being a faith-based kind of thing? How do you explain it?
There's still a small segment that still is in favor of it and supports to have some scientific basis, although they don't. So that's still there. You find a much larger group in the evangelical Christian community or any of the sort of fundamentalist religious communities, not necessarily Christian. There's a fairly prominent group in the Jewish faith as well.
Lala.
One of the things that I found most fascinating about Mathew's story was his therapist, who I called John in the piece, because he, still has practice, doesn't want to be identified. He really doesn't fit the mold of a lot of the therapists who, still go on TV and saying they believe reparative therapy exists. He describes himself to me as a, progressive NPR listening kind of a guy, and he says that he never had any agenda. This was never a political project for him in the way that it really is for some people who still do it today. He did it because patients came to him and said, I have these feelings, I don't want to have them, is there anything you can do? And that's when he kind of discovered them in the 90s. And it was very much as Dr. McDowell said, it was this impulse to help people. And it took him a number of years to realize that it really wasn't helping people. But it was fascinating to me because he said that he noticed that his colleagues, one of the reasons he got out of it is he noticed that his colleagues in the field were different from him in this way, that they did have this ideological battle in mind as part of their therapeutic work. And that was the thing that ultimately made him, in addition to Mathew's failed treatment, made him so uncomfortable that he just wanted to renounce it entirely.
How old is this guy? Did you get an impression?
I would describe him as, I would say, like late 30s, early 40s.
Okay, because obviously it's surprisingly recent how recently homosexuality ceased being diagnostically treated as a disease. So I can understand, again, that if you're in your 60s or 70s, you were probably brought up in an environment in which this was a clinical condition which needed and deserved treatment, and maybe that would come from a place of goodwill. Well,
again, this therapist, he got into it in the resurgence in the 90s, and he wasn't part of the Christian right, but he was connected. He had a Christian upbringing. He wasn't a intensely religious upbringing, but he did come from a Christian background, and he had gotten a lot of referrals through the Catholic Church and through other church connections, and so in a sense, he was tangentially connected to this religious the rise of the religious right, because as all of this kind of anti-gay propaganda was coming out, these men were saying, oh my God, I feel that, I might be gay and I really don't want to be. And so that was how he kind of got involved in the 90s when you would think
it's his responsibility as a therapist to rely on science and medicine and evidence, not to rely on full-page ads that the evangelical Christians take out in the New York Times saying that gayness can be changed.
I totally agree. And one of the things that's interesting is that when the American Psychological Association did a review of this, they started in 2007, published in 2009, and they said actually the science, there's no way of knowing right now based on science whether sexuality can be changed or not. There's not a single study that really shows either way, but they concluded the risks appear to outweigh the benefits.
Dr. McDowell, I wonder whether, something that I raised when I was speaking with the president of Exodus, who shut down that organisation last week. He now claims to be happily married. He is married. I don't know how happily with a wife, and there's no reason to dispute that he had homosexual feelings when he was young, and that he now has a monogamous heterosexual relationship. And one thing that I floated was that the elephant in the room in all of this is the concept of bisexuality, and the concept that sexuality is a bit fluid, and that some people are capable of having had same-sex attractions in their youth. They can have gone through periods like that, and then they can have, happy heterosexual marriages. Do you think that the existence of that, in other words, the existence of some people for whom reparative therapy seems to work simply because they're somewhere in the middle of the sexuality spectrum, makes it more difficult to stamp out?
Yes. Sexuality is fluid. Bisexuality is the norm in some states. People find men or women who are very attractive. It also, a fluid sexuality, especially when someone's very young, is sort of normal. So there definitely can be cases, and he may be one of them, of somebody who was a little confused first, but primarily heterosexual, and probably would have ended up that as heterosexual, if that's indeed his journey, without the kind of therapy. I just think the people that seek out the therapy are people who are tormented by something that's fundamental within them, most of them, and to try to stamp out something that is essentially true about yourself. Maybe, certainly there's genetic components, certainly there's some environmental impact, but it's clearly cemented and firm from a very early age. To try to stamp that out, generally it ends up being very hurtful.
Sean, thanks for coming back on HuffPost Live, mate. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Tell us, remind us of your story, because it fits in more closely hues to the evangelical mold.
Well, it was the evangelical church taught that everybody's inherently broken, and it's kind of we're dealt our own card as far as sin. So being gay and realizing that was kind of what I was dealt per the sin nature. So when I came to Christ when I was, I think I was 13 years old, and quickly was going through puberty, and I realized what was going on with me. I realized that it was a problem, not who I was, and it needed to be dealt with. Yet at the same time, this is, in the 90s, there was, the conversation on homosexuality today as compared to the 90s is completely different. So it was something that I just needed to fix because, it was against God's will, sin, and my ultimate destination would be separation from God and hell if I didn't deal with it.
And what did the therapy entail? How did you get into it?
Well, therapy for a lot of these people that go through gay reparative therapy, it's not just the therapy. It's a decade in church that I spent where, you would have all sorts of people come up to you and say that, my mother, she had a babysitter say when I was young, there's something wrong with your son. And then when I was in the church, multiple people were like, you have a spirit. And I was a Pentecostal evangelical. You have a spirit. You're demonically possessed. And there was always different people coming up to me and telling me what ideas they had to fix me. And so when reparative therapy was not, people like to sit there kind of, because I chose to go into it, yet it was a last-ditch effort kind of thing. Like I had to do it because I was so brainwashed into religion, not faith, that it was something that I had to do. So when I got into it, the program is incredibly abusive. They, try to convince you that you're molested when you're not, say that you were oppressed. They want to know, I said this before in the program last week, how many times I masturbated. They encourage hugging your father shirtless. If you don't fully submit to the will of the group leader as far as questions answered, they deem you rebellious and they deem you undeliverable. And this is why it's important to ban reparative therapy for teenagers, because the damage for me when I was a minor, it haunts me to this day. And I'm perfectly comfortable and happy with being gay. I was at a gay bar last night.
I hope you got lucky. You raised the issue of banning this, and this is really where it starts getting controversial. I just want to read a couple of comments that are coming in from viewers as they watch this. Zev Hadash says, I'd like to see a study on survivors of reparative therapy. Having been through it twice, 11 and 14, I can say the damage is still there after 26 years. He says, my parents were sure drugging the gay away would secure my future. What it did was create a man with severely low self-esteem that made multiple attempts at suicide over the next 20 plus years. To this day, it haunts me. Clay Arnold, who's a blogger here at HuffPost, says, for someone who's been through the therapy, I can tell you firsthand the damage this voodoo does to someone. Unfortunately, I don't think this harmful practice will be 100% eradicated anytime soon, not without protective legislation. Lila, what's the landscape look like in terms of legislation that could protect teenagers and minors from being subjected to this?
It's very uncertain right now. So this law passed in California.
What exactly did the law ban?
Banned licensed therapists from trying to change the sexual orientation of minors. So, right away, this already does not apply to a lot of people, like all the life coaches out there and,
any
church
religious
ministry
instructor,
groups.
exactly.
It would have no impact on that. But, when you look at Mathew's story, it obviously would have changed that. His, therapist was in California trying to change the sexual orientation of a minor, and he said that he supports the ban and he wouldn't have done it had it been illegal.
Now, why does this have to be enforced by law? I would have thought that in order to call yourself a therapist, if you want to be a member of whatever the board of therapy is that registers you and accepts you, that you have to disavow these kinds of techniques. Is that not the case?
At this point, it would be the case, because if you're part of the American Psychological Association or Psychiatric Association, say, they have cautioned against it and, you know, discouraged any members from doing it. And you could, in theory, there could be a complaint issued against you, and that does happen. There have been complaints issued.
Well,
Yeah, Matthew, jump in.
Anyone can call themselves a therapist.
Yes.
And there's no regulation on that. Somebody can call themselves anything. So I do think that probably the only effective way the state can be involved is to, you know, at least go after at first the licensed therapists. So there are many. There's social workers. There's lots of kinds of licenses to deal with it.
But
well, I think
go ahead, Matthew.
The government intervention is really a red flag, and yes, it doesn't cover all those people who are not licensed, but it's really an opportunity for parents to question what they're about to do or have for their child, for their well-being. And it's really the question, if you know, a lot of the argument is that the child wants to change. I think the question is, why does a child feel that way at such a young age that they think they should be changing?
Absolutely, yeah.
Something that's natural as love, and something as natural as a feeling, you know, it's a natural tendency to have feelings like that as a homosexual. So the question really is, why does a child feel that way? Then what kind of therapy should we put the child in? I think it's a big caution for parents to really question what's best for the child.
I think it's from a political legislative perspective too. I think there actually could be a valid loophole to get around the religious organization thing. That parents should not force their children to do this no matter what. So when legislation goes forward in these states, they need to make sure, yes, you know, you can't legislate somebody's religion, yet it needs to be banned from forcing teenagers to go to it at all against their will. And that would really make it effective. You know, you're not going to stop somebody from sending their kid to church, yet a kid, you know, they need to literally, I think, involve Child Protective Services. And if a kid can go to Child Protective Services and say, my parents are forcing me to go to reparative therapy because they believe that it's their religion, and that should be against the law. And that's the way you can get around the religious issues, I think.
Well, of course, the deeper problem, though. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, sorry, Sean, the deeper problem there, of course, is what you alluded to before, which is that if you're a child, you don't know that you're in the right to do that if you're brought up in a household that's so deranged by religious delusion that they've convinced you that you're the source of the problem. You know, there's a deeper problem here than just the therapy. It's the entire,
I agree.
It's the entire bedrock of bigoted religion that fuels it. But Dr. McDowell, jump in.
I was just going to say we ban all kinds of other destructive interventions, so I completely agree it should be banned.
Is there any way, I mean, legally that one could ban, and would one want to ban all therapists from doing this regardless of whether or not they have a professional affiliation with an association?
I can't imagine how that would actually legally look at this point. I mean, it's like, how do you regulate something like a life coach or a ministry? I mean, if you think about this, like, it's already unclear whether the California law is currently blocked and waiting for a ruling from the Court of Appeals in California.
On free speech grounds?
Religious free speech, parental rights, religious liberty. That's just talking about a licensed therapist. It's unclear. I mean, experts expect that litigation to drag on for years potentially. And until we really know how that plays out, it's unclear what will happen in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, other states that are, I mean, New Jersey's on the verge of passing this now. But I'm sure, you know, the people who brought the California lawsuits are definitely planning on bringing more legislation. So if you imagine how this would, you know, for a licensed therapist, what they would do if they thought it would affect their ministries, I mean, that would be a much more intensely controversial issue.
In terms of, we had a comment earlier from one of our viewers saying that they'd like to see a study of survivors of reparative therapy. Such a study has been conducted. The results here are being chatted to me by Michael Busey. Harms that were documented include shame, 80%, emotional harm, 79%, depression, 72%, reinforced self-hate, 63%, and strikingly 41% of those who said they were harmed said they felt suicidal because of the therapy. So clearly anyone who still engages in this is long past their use by date. Thank you so much, Dr. McDowell and Matthew and Sean, for sharing your story.
Thank you very much.
All the best to both of you. Lila, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Great.
Thanks for stopping by. You can let us know what you think by leaving a comment in the comment well. You can send us an email, and you can find articles about this in the resource well. This is HuffPost Live.